She hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. Everyone in that dusty Texas saloon believed she was deaf, mute, broken beyond repair. Her own father climbed onto a table and auctioned her off like livestock. $20 for a woman who couldn't hear, couldn't speak, couldn't testify against the horrors done to her. But there was one man in that room who saw through everything. A Texas Ranger who had lost his wife and son to the same monster who killed her mother. And when he leaned close and whispered 5 words into her ear, everything changed. I know you can hear. What happens next is a story of revenge, impossible odds, and a secret black book containing 47 names. 47 women sold into slavery by the most powerful man in Texas. But here's the question that will haunt you until the end. When you've been silent for so long, do you still remember how to scream? The lesson. Sometimes survival means becoming invisible. But true courage is choosing to be seen again, even when speaking up could cost you everything. This story reminds us that our voice is our greatest weapon. No matter how long you've been silenced, it's never too late to speak your truth. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling me, what would you have done in Sarah's position? Like this video if you believe the silent deserve to be heard. Share it with someone who needs courage today. And subscribe so you never miss another story that matters. The summer of 1874 came to Texas like a curse wrapped in heat and red dust. The sun beat down on the panhandle with the fury of a vengeful god, cracking the earth and turning the creeks to ribbons of mud. In the town of Esperanza, which means hope in the old Spanish tongue, there was precious little of that commodity to be found. The Dusty Rose Saloon squatted at the end of Main Street like a toad on a lily pad. Its paint was peeling. Its windows were yellow with tobacco smoke. And on this particular night, it was full of the kind of men who had forgotten what their mothers taught them about decency. Caleb Sterling sat in the corner, his back to the wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was a big man, wide across the shoulders, with hands that could gentle a horse or break a man's jaw with equal ease. His beard was dark and full, streaked with early gray, and his eyes were the color of gunmetal in winter. He was 35 years old, but the lines on his face told the story of a man who had lived twice that. On his chest, hidden beneath his worn leather vest, lay a silver star. Texas Ranger. He had worn that badge for 3 years now, ever since the night Gentry's men burned his homestead to the ground. Ever since they murdered his wife, Mary, and his boy, Samuel, who was only 3 years old and had his mother's eyes. They had made it look like a Comanchero raid. But Caleb knew better. He knew it was Colonel Marcus Gentry, the cattle baron who owned half of Texas and the souls of the other half. Caleb had been getting too close to Gentry's operation, too close to the truth about the women who disappeared from the border towns, too close to the ledgers that recorded every bribe, every murder, every life sold for profit. So Gentry had taken everything from him. Now Caleb was here in this stinking saloon, on the trail of a black book that could bring the whole rotten empire crashing down. A book that had belonged to a woman named Martha Miller, who had kept the records for Gentry before she discovered what he really was, before they killed her for knowing too much. The piano player, a nervous fellow with sweat staining his collar, was plinking out a tune that sounded like a dying cat. The poker tables were full of cowboys fresh off the cattle drive, their pockets heavy with pay they would lose before sunrise. The bar was 3 deep with men ordering whiskey that tasted like turpentine and called it medicine. And then the doors swung open. Otis Miller stumbled in like a man walking to his own hanging. He was thin as a scarecrow with a face that had been handsome once, before the whiskey carved it into something pitiful. His clothes were filthy. His hands shook. And behind him, moving like a ghost, came a young woman. She was maybe 21 years old, with hair the color of wheat in summer and eyes as blue as the Texas sky after a storm. But those eyes were empty. They stared at the floor, at nothing, at some distant place that only she could see. Her dress was patched and faded. Her shoes were held together with hope and string, and around her thin shoulders she clutched a ragged shawl like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Caleb straightened in his chair. He knew that face. He had seen a sketch of it in the Ranger files. Sarah Miller, daughter of Martha Miller. The girl who had gone deaf and mute 3 years ago, the same night her mother died. The girl who might know where the black book was hidden. Otis climbed onto a table, swaying dangerously, and the saloon went quiet. Even the piano player stopped his torture of the keys. Men turned to look, their faces showing curiosity. Then something darker. "She is deaf," Otis bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. "Dumb as a fence post, cannot hear a thing, cannot say a word." He grabbed a handful of his daughter's hair and yanked her head back. She did not make a sound. She did not flinch. She just stared at the ceiling with those empty eyes. "Who wants her?" Otis continued. "Strong as a mule, cooks and cleans. And the best part," he leaned forward with a conspiratorial grin, "you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want, and she will never tell a soul, because she cannot hear a damn thing." A ripple of dark laughter moved through the crowd. In a lawless town like Esperanza, a woman who could not hear and could not testify was a valuable commodity to the wrong kind of men. "I will give you $10, a voice sneered from the shadows. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew that voice. Silas Vane, Gentry's foreman, his right hand, his executioner. The man who had personally supervised the burning of Caleb's homestead. The man who had made it look like a Comanche raid. Vane stepped into the light, and Caleb felt his hand drift toward his pistol. The foreman was tall and lean, with a scar running through his left eyebrow and eyes that held all the warmth of a rattlesnake. He wore 2 pistols on his hips and a knife on his belt, and he moved like a man who knew how to use all 3. "Colonel Gentry needs quiet help at the ranch," Vane said, approaching the table. "A woman who cannot hear or speak would be perfect for certain duties." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Every man in that saloon knew what happened to women who went to Gentry's ranch. They knew, and they did nothing, because Gentry owned the sheriff and the judge and half the territory. $20, Otis said eagerly. "Make it 20, Mr. Vane, and she is yours right now." Vane grinned, showing teeth that were yellow in the lamplight. He reached out a gloved hand to touch Sarah's chin, tilting her face toward the light. She did not react. She did not blink. She was a statue carved from flesh and silence. 15, Vane said, "and not a penny more." "Sold!" Otis shouted, nearly falling off the table. "Take her! She is deaf! Take her!" Caleb stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, the way a man moves when he wants everyone in the room to see him coming. He stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and the crowd parted for him like water around a stone. He was bigger than Vane, broader, and there was something in his eyes that made men think twice about reaching for their guns. He did not draw his weapon. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table, where it landed with a heavy thunk that made Otis's eyes go wide. $200, Caleb said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "The girl's debt is paid. She walks out with me." The saloon went silent. $200 was a fortune. It was more money than most men would see in a year. It was enough to buy a small ranch, a herd of cattle, a new life. Vane's face went purple with rage. "You cannot just walk in here and interfere with legitimate business. I had a deal with this man." "The deal is done," Caleb said. He looked at Otis, who was clutching the pouch like a man holding his own salvation. "You got your money, Miller. More than you deserve. Now step away from the girl." Otis scrambled off the table, muttering thanks that no one believed. But Vane was not finished. His hand dropped to his pistol, his fingers curling around the grip. "You do not know who you are dealing with," Vane hissed. "Colonel Gentry does not take kindly to interference." Caleb looked at him. Just looked. And something in that gaze made Vane hesitate. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything. A man who had nothing left to fear. "I have killed 16 men," Caleb said quietly. "You want to be 17. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Vane's hand relaxed. He stepped back, a smile spreading across his face that did not reach his eyes. "This is not over," Vane said. "I will find out who you are. And when I do, you will wish you had stayed in whatever hole you crawled out of." Caleb did not respond. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing motionless by the table, her eyes fixed on nothing. He extended his hand. "Come with me," he said, "or stay here with them. Your choice." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly Sarah lifted her gaze. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and something flickered in those empty eyes, something that might have been hope. She took his hand. Caleb led her through the crowd, through the doors, out into the night. The air was still hot, thick with dust and the smell of horses. He guided her to where his horse was tied, a big bay gelding named Prophet, and lifted her into the saddle. As he checked the cinch, he leaned in close. His face was inches from hers. The wind was rising, carrying the sounds of the saloon away into the darkness, and in a voice so low that only she could hear, he whispered 5 words that changed everything. "I know you can hear." Sarah's eyes went wide. Her breath caught in her throat. For 3 years, she had played this part. For 3 years, she had been deaf to the world, silent as a grave. It was her armor, her protection, her only defense against men who would use her words against her. And in one sentence, this stranger had seen through all of it. Caleb did not wait for a response. He swung up behind her, gathered the reins, and spurred Prophet into a gallop. They rode into the darkness, leaving Esperanza and its false hope behind. In the saloon, Silas Vane was already writing a letter to Colonel Gentry. "The deaf girl got away," it said. "A stranger bought her. Send orders. The hunt had begun." They rode through the night, putting miles between themselves and Esperanza. The Texas panhandle stretched out around them like an ocean of grass and scrub, silver under the light of a 3/4 moon. Caleb knew this land. He had tracked outlaws across it, hunted Comancheros through its hidden canyons, buried friends in its red earth. Sarah sat rigid in front of him, her body tense as a coiled spring. She had not spoken. She had not moved. She was still playing the part, even though they both knew the game was over. Caleb did not push. He had seen wounded animals before. He knew that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned, one small step at a time. They made camp at dawn in a shallow arroyo, where a trickle of water ran between red rocks and a stand of mesquite trees offered shade from the rising sun. Caleb built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and set a pot of coffee to boil. He pulled some jerky from his saddlebags and offered a piece to Sarah. She took it without looking at him. She ate mechanically, her eyes fixed on the flames. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a mockingbird. Caleb let it be. He had learned long ago that silence was not always empty. Sometimes it was full of words waiting to be spoken. Finally, as the sun climbed higher and the shadows retreated, Sarah spoke. "How did you know?" Her voice was rusty, like a door hinge that had not been used in years. But it was there, real, alive. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. "Your eyes," he said. "Back in the saloon when Vane cocked his pistol, your pupils dilated. Your left ear twitched toward the sound. Tiny movements. Most men would never notice, but I am not most men." Sarah stared at him over the rim of her cup. "Who are you?" "My name is Caleb Sterling. I am a Texas Ranger." He saw the fear flash across her face, saw her muscles tense for flight. Rangers meant law. Law meant questions. Questions meant danger. "I am not here to arrest you," he said quickly. "I am here because of Colonel Gentry." At the name, Sarah's face went pale. Her hands trembled, sloshing coffee over the rim of her cup. "You know that name," Caleb said. It was not a question. Everyone knows that name. Sarah's voice was bitter. He owns this territory. He owns the law. He owns everyone and everything. Not everyone. Caleb took a sip of his coffee. Not me. He told her then. He told her about Mary, who had hair like gold in the sunlight. About Samuel, who was 3 years old and had just learned to say Papa. About the morning he rode out to check the north fence and came back to find nothing but smoke and ashes. They said it was Comancheros, he said, revenge for a raid I led, but I found evidence. Boot prints that matched cavalry boots, not moccasins. Spent cartridges from army rifles, not trade muskets. It was Gentry's men, dressed up to look like raiders. They killed my family because I was getting too close to his operation. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My mother worked for him. She kept his books. His real books, not the ones he shows to the taxman." "I know," Caleb said. "That is why I am here." 3 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, she found out what he was really doing. The women who came up from Mexico looking for work, they never made it to the ranches where they were supposed to go. Gentry was selling them. Selling them like cattle to men who did not want wives, men who wanted property. Human trafficking, Caleb said grimly. We suspected, but we could never prove it. My mother could prove it. She wrote everything down. Dates, names, amounts. She was going to take it to the federal marshal in San Antonio. But Gentry found out. Sarah nodded. They came in the night. 3 men. My father was drunk, as always. He did not even try to stop them. My mother told me to hide in the root cellar. She gave me the book and told me to run. To not speak. To not hear. To become invisible. Her voice broke. Caleb waited. I watched through the cracks in the floor. I watched them kill her. And the last thing she said was my name. Sarah. Like a prayer. The fire had burned down to embers. The sun was high now, casting harsh shadows across the arroyo. Caleb reached out and placed his hand over hers. Your mother was brave, he said. She died trying to do the right thing. Now we have a chance to finish what she started. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the pain in his eyes, the same pain that lived in her own heart. She saw a man who had lost everything and kept fighting anyway. Where is the book? Caleb asked. Sarah hesitated. Then she reached down to the hem of her dress where the fabric was doubled over and sewn with tiny, careful stitches. She pulled out a small knife and cut the threads, revealing a hidden pocket. From within, she drew a slim book bound in black leather. It was worn from handling, stained with something that might have been blood. She held it like it was both a treasure and a curse. 47 names, she said. 47 women who were sold like livestock, and the names of everyone who helped make it happen. Sheriffs, judges, a state senator. Caleb took the book with reverent care. He opened it to a random page and began to read. His face hardened with each entry. Then he stopped. His breath caught. His hand began to shake. What is it? Sarah asked. Caleb looked up at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. My brother, he said. Ethan. He came out here to prospect for gold. 2 years ago, they found him mauled. Everyone said it was a grizzly bear. He turned the book so Sarah could see the entry. Ethan Sterling, eliminated, made to look like animal attack. $100. He saw something, Caleb said, at Gentry's ranch. He must have seen something he should not have. And they killed him for it, made it look like an accident. Sarah placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light, hesitant, but it anchored him. Then we make them pay, she said. For Ethan, for your wife and son, for my mother, for all 47 of those women. Caleb closed the book and tucked it inside his vest, next to his heart. There is a place, he said, a safe house. It is run by a woman named Rosa Delgado. Her husband was killed by Gentry's men. She has been helping people escape ever since. Can we trust her? With our lives. Caleb stood and began to kick dirt over the fire. We ride through the day, stay off the main roads. If Vane is smart, and he is, he will have men watching every crossing between here and the border." They mounted up and rode south, toward the distant blue smudge of the mountains. The land changed as they went, from flat grassland to rolling hills dotted with cedar and oak. They crossed dry creek beds and skirted around small ranches where dogs barked at their passing. By evening, they reached a small canyon that wound between red sandstone walls. At the end of the canyon stood a building that might have been a mission once, or a fort. Its walls were thick adobe, its windows narrow and deep. A sign above the door read, "Posada del Sol, Inn of the Sun." A woman emerged as they approached. She was perhaps 40 years old, with silver streaking her black hair, and eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. She wore a pistol on her hip like she knew how to use it. "Ranger Sterling," she said, "you bring me another broken bird. This one has claws, Rosa." Caleb helped Sarah down from the horse. "And teeth. She has proof, Rosa. Real proof. Names and dates and dollar amounts. Enough to bring Gentry down." Rosa's eyes widened. She looked at Sarah with new respect. Then she stepped forward and took the younger woman's hands in her own. "Welcome to the Posada del Sol, child. Here, you are safe. Here, no one will hurt you again." She led them inside into cool shadows and the smell of cooking beans. There were other women there, Sarah noticed. 3 of them, sitting in a back room, their eyes full of the same haunted emptiness she had seen in her own reflection for 3 years. Survivors, refugees, sisters in suffering. Rosa saw where Sarah was looking. "They were taken by Gentry's men," she explained. "We smuggled them out before they could be sold. There is a network, tunnels and safe houses all the way to Mexico. My husband built it before they killed him." "Your husband was a good man," Caleb said. "He was." Rosa's voice was soft. "And every life we save is another stone in his memorial." She led them to a room at the back of the posada, where a trap door was hidden beneath a worn rug. She lifted it to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. "The cellar," she said. "If anyone comes, this is where you hide. There is a tunnel at the back. It leads to a chapel 3 miles from here. That is where you go if things get bad." Sarah climbed down the ladder, followed by Caleb. The cellar was cool and dry, lit by a single lantern. There were blankets and supplies, enough for several people to survive for days. "How long do we have to wait?" Sarah asked. Rosa looked at Caleb. "Judge Harlan is coming to Austin in 3 weeks. They call him the hangman because he cannot be bought. If we can get that book to him, along with witnesses willing to testify, Gentry is finished." 3 weeks, Sarah said. 3 weeks of hiding. 3 weeks of preparing, Caleb corrected. "Because Gentry is not going to wait for us to make the first move. He is going to come looking, and when he does, we need to be ready." Rosa nodded grimly. "Gentry's men were here 2 days ago asking about a deaf girl with a black book. They know you are coming. They just do not know where you are going." "Then we better make sure they never find out," Caleb said. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The hunt was on, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. 3 days passed in the cellar beneath the Posada del Sol. 3 days of waiting, of planning, of learning to trust. Sarah had not spoken much at first. The habit of silence was hard to break after 3 years of pretending. But Rosa was patient, bringing her food and water, sitting with her in the darkness, asking nothing but offering everything. On the 3rd night, Sarah finally began to talk. She told Rosa about her mother, Martha, who had been beautiful and kind, and had believed that the truth could change the world. She told her about Otis, who had been a good father once before the gambling debts and the whiskey turned him into something hollow. She told her about the night her mother died, about hiding in the root cellar and watching through the cracks in the floor, about the men who came with torches and guns, about the way her mother had said her name one last time like a prayer. And she told her about the silence, how it had started as a disguise and become a prison, How she had spent 3 years watching and listening, gathering secrets, waiting for a chance that never seemed to come. Until Caleb Sterling walked into that saloon and saw right through her. "He is a good man," Rosa said. "Hard, yes. Scarred by what he has lost, but good." "I know," Sarah said. "I can see it in his eyes." Meanwhile, Caleb was making plans. He had sent messages through Rosa's network, reaching out to the few men he still trusted. Rangers who had not been bought by Gentry's gold. Lawmen who still believed in justice. Most importantly, he had sent word to Captain Thomas Webb in Austin. Webb was his commanding officer, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War who had taught Caleb everything he knew about tracking and survival. If anyone could bring enough men to take on Gentry, it was Webb. But responses took time. Days passed with no word. And every day that passed was another day for Gentry to tighten his grip. On the fourth night, Caleb came down to the cellar with the black book in his hands. He sat across from Sarah, the lantern between them casting long shadows on the walls. "I need to read you something," he said. Sarah nodded. Caleb opened the book to a page near the back, a page covered in his mother's careful handwriting. October 12, 1871. Payment to Sheriff Miller, $200. Silence regarding the fire at the O'Malley Ranch. Sarah's breath caught. Sheriff Miller was her uncle, her father's brother. She had always wondered how he could afford that big house in town. November 3, 1871. Payment to Silas Vane, $50. Removal of a squatter on the North Ridge. Make it look like a bear attack. "That was Ethan," Caleb said quietly. "My brother. $50. That is what his life was worth to them." Sarah reached across and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and rough, but they closed around hers with a gentleness that surprised her. December 15th, 1871, Caleb continued. Shipment of 12 women from Nuevo Laredo. Payment received from buyers in Louisiana. Total, $3,600. 12 women, Sarah whispered, sold like cattle. And that is just one entry. Caleb closed the book. There are dozens more. Years of records, names, dates, amounts. Every crime Gentry has ever committed, written down in black and white. Why did my mother keep such detailed records? Because she believed in the truth. Caleb looked at Sarah with something like admiration. She knew that someday someone would need this evidence. She was building a case, one entry at a time. And now we have it. Now we have it. Caleb tucked the book back inside his vest. But evidence is not enough. We need witnesses, people who will stand up in court and testify against Gentry. "The women," Sarah said, "the ones Rosa saved. They could testify. They could. But they are scared. They have seen what happens to people who cross Gentry. Then we need to show them that Gentry can be beaten." Sarah's voice was stronger now, more certain. "We need to give them hope, give them—" Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. A small, sad smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. Before Sarah could respond, the trapdoor above them flew open. Rosa's face appeared, pale and frightened. "They are coming," she said. "Gentry's men, a dozen of them, maybe more. They are searching every building on the road." Caleb was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his pistol. "How long? Minutes? Maybe less." "Take the women through the tunnel," Caleb ordered. "Get them to the chapel. Sarah goes with you." "No." Sarah stood up, her chin lifted defiantly. "I am not running anymore. This is not the time for heroics. I am not being heroic. I am being practical." Sarah grabbed a rifle from the wall rack, checking the chamber with practiced ease. "If I run now, they will chase me. But if I stay, if I help you hold them off, we might all get away." Caleb hesitated. Then he nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. "Can you shoot that thing? My mother taught me. She said a Texas woman should never be helpless. Smart woman." Caleb turned to Rosa. "Get the others to safety. We will buy you time." Rosa nodded and disappeared. A moment later, they heard the sound of the hidden tunnel being opened, the shuffle of feet as the refugees fled into the darkness. Caleb and Sarah climbed up from the cellar and positioned themselves at the windows. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. And on the road, a cloud of dust was approaching. Gentry's men. They came in fast, spreading out to surround the building. Sarah counted 11 riders, all armed with rifles and pistols. At their head rode a man she recognized from her nightmares. Silas Vane. He stopped his horse in front of the posada and called out in a voice like gravel. "We know you are in there, Sterling. We know you have the girl. Send her out, and maybe we let you live." Caleb did not respond. He sighted down the barrel of his rifle, tracking Vane's movements. "You have until the count of 10, Vane continued. 1, 2, 3. On 3, Caleb fired. The shot was not aimed at Vane, but at the man beside him. The rider toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. All hell broke loose. Gentry's men opened fire, their bullets punching through the adobe walls like fists through paper. Caleb and Sarah ducked behind the windowsills, returning fire when they could. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder of gunshots and shattering glass. Sarah felt a bullet whistle past her ear. She did not flinch. She sighted down her rifle and squeezed the trigger, and a man fell from his horse with a scream. "Good shot!" Caleb shouted over the chaos. "Keep your head down!" The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. By the time the shooting stopped, 3 of Gentry's men were dead, and 2 more were wounded. But Vane and the others had retreated, regrouping at the edge of the canyon. "They will be back," Caleb said grimly, "with reinforcements. Then we need to go." Sarah grabbed the saddlebags she had packed earlier. "The tunnel. Rosa said it leads to a chapel." Caleb nodded. He took one last look out the window, watching Vane's silhouette against the fading light. Then he turned and followed Sarah down into the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crouch as they ran. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old earth. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Behind them, she heard the crash of the trap door being kicked open. Vane's voice echoed down the tunnel, full of rage. Find them both. Gentry wants that book." Caleb grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her faster. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off in different directions. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, taking turns without hesitation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into the cool night air. They were in a small cemetery surrounded by weathered headstones and twisted mesquite trees. And before them stood a chapel, its whitewashed walls glowing in the moonlight. "Calvary Chapel," Caleb said. "We made it." The door opened, and a figure stepped out. He was tall and broad, with skin the color of mahogany and a scar running down his left cheek. He wore the simple clothes of a preacher, but his eyes had the look of a soldier. "Ranger Sterling," he said, his voice deep as a well. "I was beginning to think you would not make it." "Elijah," Caleb replied. "It is good to see you. And this must be Miss Miller." The preacher turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "Welcome to God's hiding place, child. Here you are safe." Sarah looked at the chapel, at the cemetery, at the man who had welcomed her with such kindness. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Reverend Elijah Cross had been many things in his 50 years of life. A slave on a Georgia plantation, a soldier in the Union Army, a wanderer in a land that did not know what to do with a free black man, and now a preacher in a forgotten chapel on the edge of the Texas wilderness. He had built this place with his own hands, hauling stones from the riverbed and cutting timber from the hills. It was not much to look at, just 4 walls and a roof and a wooden cross above the altar. But it was his, and it was safe, and it was the only home he had ever truly known. The chapel served as the final station on Rosa's underground network. Escaped women passed through here on their way to Mexico, where they could start new lives far from Gentry's reach. Elijah fed them, sheltered them, prayed with them, and sent them on their way with his blessing and whatever supplies he could spare. It was dangerous work, Gentry's men had come looking before, and they would come looking again. But Elijah had faced danger all his life. He had learned that fear was a luxury he could not afford. Now he stood in the chapel's main room, watching as Caleb Sterling paced before the altar like a caged wolf. Sarah Miller sat in a pew, the black book open in her lap. Rosa Delgado had arrived through the tunnel an hour ago, along with the 3 women she had been sheltering. Everyone was safe, for now. "We cannot stay here long," Caleb said. "Vane will figure out where we went. He will bring more men." "Then we need to move," Rosa said. "Take the women to Mexico. Get them across the border before Gentry can stop us." "No," Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood up, the book clutched to her chest. "Running is not enough. We have been running for 3 years. My mother ran, and they killed her. These women ran, and Gentry just found more victims to replace them." "What are you suggesting?" Elijah asked. "I am suggesting we fight back." Sarah looked at Caleb. "You said there is a judge, someone who cannot be bought. Judge Harlan, the hangman. He is coming to Austin in 3 weeks," Caleb confirmed. "Then we get this book to him. We testify in open court. We bring Gentry down, not just for us, but for every woman he has ever hurt." The room was silent. Then Rosa spoke, her voice heavy with doubt. "The road to Austin is long. Gentry has men everywhere. And even if we make it, what makes you think anyone will believe us? The word of a drunk's daughter against the word of a cattle baron." "The book," Sarah said. "The book makes them believe. Every name, every date, every dollar. It is all here, written in my mother's hand." Caleb stepped forward. "She is right. This is our chance, maybe our only chance. If we run now, Gentry wins. He keeps selling women, keeps buying lawmen, keeps building his empire on blood and silence. But if we fight, if we take this to court and make it stick, we can destroy him." Elijah nodded slowly. "The Lord helps those who help themselves. I have always believed that." "So we fight," Rosa said. She did not sound happy about it, but there was steel in her voice. "What do we need?" Caleb began to outline the plan. They would travel to a place called Devil's Backbone, a limestone ridge in the hill country, where the terrain would give them an advantage. He had already sent word to Captain Webb, asking him to meet them there with reinforcements. If all went well, they would have a dozen rangers at their backs when they made their stand. But first, they had to survive the journey. "We leave at dawn," Caleb said. "Travel light, move fast, stay off the main roads. Rosa, you take the women through the southern route. It is longer, but safer." "And Sarah?" Rosa asked. "Sarah comes with me." Caleb looked at her, and something passed between them that the others could not quite read. She is the key witness. Without her testimony, the book is just paper. "I can take care of myself," Sarah said. "You have seen that, I have. But Gentry wants you more than he wants any of us. He will throw everything he has at bringing you down. And we better make sure he fails." The night passed slowly. Caleb stood watch at the chapel door, his rifle across his knees. Rosa tended to the women who were too frightened to sleep. Elijah sat at the altar, his lips moving in silent prayer. And Sarah sat alone in a pew, the black book open before her, reading by candlelight. She had not looked at the entries for a long time, not since the night her mother died, when she had hidden the book in her dress and sworn to protect it with her life. But now, in the quiet of the chapel, she forced herself to read every page. It was worse than she remembered. The women's names were all there, Mexican girls mostly, some as young as 15. They had come north looking for work, for opportunity, for a better life. And Gentry had taken them, had sold them to men who saw them as property, not people. Some of the buyers were ranchers, some were miners, some were from places far away, Louisiana and Mississippi and beyond. Men who wanted servants who could not complain, who wanted something worse than servants. Sarah thought of the women sleeping in the back room. They were the lucky ones. They had escaped. But how many others had not been so fortunate? How many were still out there, suffering in silence, waiting for help that would never come? "Not anymore," Sarah whispered to the empty chapel. "I will be their voice. I will speak for them, even if it kills me." She did not realize she had spoken aloud until she heard footsteps behind her. Caleb sat down beside her, his presence solid and warm in the darkness. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be hard." "I cannot. Every time I close my eyes, I see their names. 47 women, Caleb. 47 lives, sold for profit." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife used to say that evil exists because good people do nothing. She believed that if you saw something wrong, you had a duty to fight it, even if the odds were against you. She sounds like my mother. I think they would have liked each other." Caleb looked at Sarah, and his eyes were soft in the candlelight. "Mary would have liked you too. She admired courage. I am not brave. I hid for 3 years. I pretended to be something I was not. You survived." Caleb took her hand, and his grip was warm and strong. "You kept that book safe. You waited for your moment. That is not cowardice, Sarah. That is strategy." Sarah looked at their joined hands. She thought of all the nights she had spent alone, locked in her silence, waiting for someone to see her. And now, in this forgotten chapel on the edge of nowhere, someone finally had. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for believing me, for giving me a reason to fight." Caleb squeezed her hand. Then he stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Get some rest," he said. "Dawn comes early, and we have a long road ahead." The journey to Devil's Backbone took 5 days. They traveled at night, hiding during the day in caves and abandoned homesteads. Caleb knew the land like he knew his own heartbeat, guiding them through canyons and across dry riverbeds where Gentry's men would not think to look. Sarah watched him as they rode, studying the way he read the landscape. He could tell the age of a track by its edges. He could smell water from a mile away. He could hear the difference between wind in the grass and the approach of riders. He had learned these skills as a ranger, he told her, tracking outlaws and fugitives across the Texas wilderness. But the lessons had come at a cost. Every trail he followed, every criminal he caught, had taken him further from the people he loved. "I was never home," he said one night as they rested in the shelter of an overhanging rock. "Mary used to joke that she was married to a ghost. She said I cared more about the badge than I did about her." "Did you?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. "I told myself I was protecting them, that every outlaw I caught was one less threat to my family. But the truth is I was running from something. I did not know how to be a husband, a father. I only knew how to be a hunter. And then they took them from you. And then they took them from me." Caleb's voice was rough with old grief. "I have had 5 years to think about what I would do differently. 5 years of wishing I had stayed home that morning, had skipped the north fence, had been there when they came. You cannot blame yourself for what Gentry did." "I know. But the guilt does not care about logic. It just sits there, heavy as a stone, reminding you of everything you lost." Sarah understood. She had carried her own stone for 3 years. The weight of her mother's death, the shame of her father's weakness, the loneliness of her self-imposed silence. "My mother told me to become invisible," she said. "She thought it would keep me safe. And it did for a while, but somewhere along the way I stopped being invisible and started being nothing. I forgot who I was. I forgot how to be. And now I am remembering." Sarah looked at Caleb, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "You helped me remember. You saw me when no one else did." Caleb reached out and touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized she was shedding. "Sarah Miller," he said softly, "you are the bravest woman I have ever known. Do not ever let anyone make you feel like nothing again." They sat in silence, the night wrapped around them like a blanket. And in that moment, something shifted between them, something that had been building since the saloon, since the first time he whispered those 5 words. "I know you can hear." They did not speak of it. There would be time for words later if they survived. But they both felt it, the connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Two broken people, finding wholeness in each other. The next morning, they were ambushed. It happened in a narrow canyon where the walls rose sheer on either side. Caleb had chosen the route because it was difficult to navigate, which meant it was difficult to surveil. But Gentry had anticipated him. The first shot came from above, kicking up dirt at Prophet's feet. Caleb hauled on the reins, spinning the horse around as more shots rang out. "Ride," he shouted, "straight through, do not stop." Sarah bent low over the horse's neck and kicked hard. Prophet surged forward, his hooves pounding the rocky ground. Behind her, she heard Caleb's rifle crack once, twice, 3 times. Then a scream, then silence. She pulled up at the far end of the canyon and looked back. Caleb was still mounted, but his left arm hung limp at his side. Blood soaked through his sleeve. "You are hurt. It is nothing." He urged his horse forward, his face pale but determined. "We need to keep moving. There will be more of them." They rode until the sun was high and Caleb could barely stay in the saddle. Sarah found a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall, and she helped him inside. She had to cut away his shirt to reach the wound, a clean hole through the meat of his upper arm. "The bullet went through," she said, examining the exit wound. "That is good. But you have lost a lot of blood. I have had worse. Stop being brave and let me help you." She cleaned the wound with water from the falls and bandaged it with strips torn from her petticoat. Her hands were steady, her movements efficient. Caleb watched her work, his eyes clouded with pain but also with something else. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My mother. She used to patch up my father after his brawls, before she gave up on him." "You have not given up on him." Sarah paused. "I do not know what I feel about my father. He sold me, Caleb, for $20. But he is still my father. Family is complicated." "Yes." She tied off the bandage and sat back. "Yes, it is." They stayed in the cave until nightfall, waiting for Caleb's strength to return. Sarah kept watch at the entrance, her rifle ready, but no one came. Perhaps the men in the canyon had been a scouting party, not a full pursuit. Perhaps Gentry did not yet know where they were headed. Or perhaps the real danger was still waiting for them at Devil's Backbone. "We should reach the meeting point tomorrow," Caleb said as they prepared to move out. "If Captain Webb got my message, he will have men waiting. And if he did not, then we improvise." Caleb smiled weakly. "I am good at improvising." They rode through the night, the moon lighting their way. And as the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, they crested a ridge and saw it spread out before them. Devil's Backbone. The ridge stretched for miles, a spine of white limestone rising from the green hills like the bones of some ancient giant. The terrain was rugged, full of caves and crevices that would make an excellent defensive position. And at the base of the ridge, a cluster of tents with the Lone Star flag flying above them. Texas Rangers. Sarah felt her heart lift for the first time in days. "They made it," she said. "They actually made it." Caleb did not respond. He was staring at the camp, his expression troubled. "Something is wrong," he said. "What do you mean?" "There should be more tents, more horses, more men." They spurred their horses down the slope, approaching the camp at a cautious walk. A sentry spotted them and raised his rifle, then lowered it as he recognized Caleb. "Ranger Sterling," the sentry said. "Captain Webb is waiting for you, but I should warn you it is not good news." They found Captain Thomas Webb in the largest tent, poring over a map spread across a makeshift table. He was a hard man, weathered by decades of frontier service, with a beard that had gone white and eyes that had seen too much death. "Sterling." He looked up as they entered. "I was beginning to think Gentry got you." "He tried." Caleb gestured to his bandaged arm. "He did not succeed. And this must be Miss Miller." Webb turned to Sarah, his expression appraising. "I have heard a lot about you, young lady, and about the book you carry." Sarah pulled the black book from inside her dress and handed it to him. 47 names, she said. 47 women sold into slavery, plus records of bribes, murders, and everything else Gentry has done for the past 10 years. Webb opened the book and began to read. His face, already grim, grew darker with each page. "This is enough to hang him," he said finally. "More than enough. Then why do you look like you are at a funeral?" Webb closed the book and handed it back to Sarah. "Because Gentry knows you are coming. He knows about the book, about the witnesses, about Judge Harlan. He has pulled in every hired gun, every bought lawman, every favor he is owed. How many men does he have?" Webb met Caleb's eyes. 35, maybe 40. "And how many do we have?" Webb gestured around the tent. "You are looking at them. 12 Rangers. That is all I could muster on short notice. The rest are scattered across the territory, too far to reach in time." 12 against 40, Caleb said slowly. "Those are not good odds." "No, they are not." Webb folded his arms. "I would not blame you if you wanted to run. Take the girl, take the book, disappear across the border, live to fight another day." Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifted. "Running is not an option. We have come too far, sacrificed too much. Those women deserve justice. My mother deserves justice." Webb looked at her for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "You have got sand, Miss Miller. I will give you that. Give you—" He turned to Caleb. "All right, Sterling. If we are going to do this, we are going to do it right. What is your plan?" Caleb bent over the map, tracing lines with his finger. "Devil's Backbone gives us the high ground," he said. "We fortify here, here, and here. Force Gentry to come at us through the narrow passes where his numbers do not matter. And the judge. Judge Harlan is in Austin. If we can hold Gentry off long enough, if we can get word to Harlan that we have the evidence and the witnesses, he will come. He has to come." Webb nodded slowly. "It is a gamble. But it might work. It has to work." Caleb looked at Sarah. "Because if it does not, everything we have fought for, everyone we have lost, will have been for nothing." They had 3 days to prepare. 3 days to turn Devil's Backbone into a fortress. 3 days to plan, to train, to pray. Caleb worked the men hard, drilling them in defensive tactics, mapping escape routes, stockpiling ammunition. The Rangers were good men, veterans of border skirmishes and outlaw hunts. They knew how to fight. But they also knew the odds, and Sarah saw the doubt in their eyes. She tried to help where she could. She cooked meals over the campfire, mended torn clothing, kept the rifles clean and loaded. Small tasks, but necessary ones. And when the Rangers looked at her, she saw their doubt slowly turning to respect. She was not just a witness anymore. She was one of them. On the second night, she found Caleb standing alone at the edge of the camp, staring out at the moonlit hills. His wounded arm was in a sling, but he held his rifle in his good hand, ever vigilant. "You should rest," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I cannot. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Mary, Samuel, Ethan, all the people I could not save. You saved me." Caleb turned to look at her. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but there was something else there, too. Something warm and vulnerable. "I did not save you, Sarah. You saved yourself. I just helped you see that you could." Sarah reached out and took his hand, his fingers intertwined with hers, strong and sure. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when Gentry is dead and the women are free, what will you do?" "I do not know." Caleb's voice was hoarse. "I have been hunting for so long, I do not know how to stop. The badge is all I have left." "That is not true." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You have me, if you want me." Caleb looked at her, and for a moment his guard dropped completely. She saw the loneliness behind his strength, the yearning beneath his resolve. "Sarah, I'm a broken man. I have nothing to offer you except enemies and danger. You are not broken." She reached up and touched his face. "You are wounded. There is a difference. And wounds heal." He pulled her close then, wrapping his good arm around her. They stood together in the moonlight, two hearts beating as one. "If we survive this," he said into her hair, "I want to start over, build a new life, not just chase the ghosts of the old one." "Then we survive," Sarah said. "We survive, and we build. Together." They kissed then, soft and sweet, and full of promise. It was not the desperate passion of doomed lovers. It was the quiet commitment of two people who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. They pulled apart as a rider galloped into camp, his horse lathered with sweat. It was one of Webb's scouts. His face was pale with fear. "They are coming," he gasped. "Gentry's men. A whole army of them. They will be here by dawn." Webb emerged from his tent, buckling on his gun belt. "How many?" "40 at least, maybe more. They have got Silas Vane at the head." Caleb's jaw tightened at the name. Vane, the man who had killed his brother, the man who had tormented Sarah, the man who represented everything evil about Gentry's empire. "All right," Caleb said, his voice steady. "This is what we prepared for. Everyone to their positions. We hold until relief arrives." The camp erupted into controlled chaos as men grabbed weapons and headed for their assigned posts. Sarah started to follow, but Caleb caught her arm. "You need to stay out of the fighting." "No," Sarah pulled free. "I can shoot as well as any of them, better than some. If you die, the testimony dies with you. Gentry wins. If I hide, I prove that I am still the scared girl who could not save her mother." Sarah met his eyes, unwavering. "I am done hiding, Caleb. I told you that." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. "Stay close to me," he said, "and if I tell you to run, you run." She promised nothing. They took their positions as the first gray light of dawn began to seep over the horizon. The Rangers spread out along the ridge, using the rocks and caves for cover. Below, the trail wound through a narrow valley, the only approach to their position. A perfect killing ground. Sarah crouched beside Caleb, her rifle ready. Her hands were steady, her heart was calm. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, even if she had not known it at the time. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Then, like a tide rising from the earth, they came. Gentry's men poured into the valley, a mass of horses and guns and murderous intent. At their head rode Silas Vane, his scar gleaming in the early light. And behind him, mounted on a white stallion like some dark king, came Colonel Marcus Gentry himself. He was older than Sarah had imagined, his hair silver beneath his cavalry hat. But his eyes were as cold as the grave, and his presence radiated a malevolent authority that made the air itself seem to cringe. "Sterling!" Gentry called out, his voice carrying across the valley. "I know you are up there. I know you have the girl and the book. This does not have to end in blood." Caleb stood, exposing himself above the rocks. "It ended in blood a long time ago, Gentry. When you murdered my wife and son. When you killed my brother. When you sold 47 women into slavery." Gentry smiled, a thin reptilian expression. "The women were merchandise. Your family was collateral damage. Business, Sterling. Nothing personal. It is personal to me. Then you are a fool." Gentry raised his hand and his men drew their weapons. "Last chance. Give me the girl and the book, and I will let the rest of you ride away." Caleb looked down at Sarah, who had risen to stand beside him. Her face was pale but determined. She shook her head. "No deal," Caleb called back. "You want her? You come get her." Gentry's smile faded. "So be it." He dropped his hand, and the valley erupted in fire and thunder. The Battle of Devil's Backbone had begun. The first wave of Gentry's men charged up the narrow trail, their horses screaming, their guns blazing. The Rangers met them with a wall of lead, their rifles cracking in steady rhythm. Men fell, horses tumbled. The trail became a chaos of blood and dust. Sarah fired and reloaded, her movements mechanical. She did not think about the men she was shooting. She thought about her mother, about the 47 names in the black book, about all the suffering that Gentry had caused. Every bullet was justice. Every shot was a prayer. The first assault broke against the rocks like a wave against a cliff. Gentry's men retreated, leaving a dozen bodies behind. But they would be back. They had the numbers, the time, the resources. All they had to do was wait. "We cannot hold forever," Webb said, sliding down beside Caleb. "We are running low on ammunition. We do not need forever. Just until relief arrives." If relief arrives. Webb's face was grim. "We have no way of knowing if the message got through. Then we make our own relief." Caleb looked at Sarah. "I have an idea, but you are not going to like it. Tell me." "Gentry wants the book. More than anything, he wants that evidence destroyed. If we can make him think the book is somewhere else, somewhere he can get to, we might be able to draw off some of his men. You want to use me as bait?" "No." Caleb's voice was firm. "I want to use myself as bait. I will ride out with a decoy, make them chase me. While they are distracted, you and Webb take the real book to Austin." "Absolutely not." Sarah grabbed his arm. "You are wounded. You will not make it 10 miles. I do not need to make it 10 miles. I just need to buy you time. Caleb, no." She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I will not lose you. Not now. Not after everything." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Sarah, listen to me. I'm not giving up. I am giving you a chance. A real chance to finish this. There has to be another way. There is not." He kissed her forehead, gentle and sad. "I love you, Sarah Miller. I think I have loved you since the moment you took my hand in that saloon. Whatever happens, remember that." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion at the edge of camp drew their attention. One of the rangers was dragging a man toward them, a young ranger named Hollis, whose face was white with terror. "Caught him trying to sneak out," the older ranger said. "Had this in his pocket." He held up a piece of paper. Webb took it, his face darkening as he read. "A message to Gentry." Webb's voice was like ice, detailing our positions, our numbers, our plans. Hollis fell to his knees. "I am sorry. I did not have a choice. Gentry has my sister. He said he would sell her if I did not cooperate." Sarah stared at the young man, seeing the fear in his eyes, the desperation. She thought of Maria, the woman who had betrayed them at the chapel, another victim turned traitor by Gentry's cruelty. "Where is your sister now?" she asked. "At the ranch. Gentry Grande. He keeps her as insurance." Webb drew his pistol. "Traitors get one punishment in the Rangers." "Wait." Sarah stepped between them. "Killing him does not help us, but he can help himself." "What do you mean?" She looked at Hollis. "You know the layout of Gentry's ranch. You know where he keeps his prisoners." "Yes." Hollis nodded frantically. "I know everything. I have been there a dozen times, delivering messages. Then you are going to help us." Sarah's voice was hard. "You are going to draw us a map. Every building, every guard post, every escape route. And when this is over, you're going to testify about everything you have seen and done. And my sister, if we win, we rescue everyone." Sarah met his eyes. "But we can only win if you help us." Hollis looked at her, at Caleb, at Webb. Then he nodded, a broken man grasping at redemption. "I will help, whatever you need." As Hollis began to sketch a map of the ranch, Sarah turned to Caleb. "New plan," she said. "We do not run, and we do not sacrifice anyone. We go on the offensive." "What are you talking about? Gentry came here expecting us to hide, to defend, to wait for rescue." She pointed at the map taking shape on the paper. "But what if we do not wait? What if we take the fight to him?" "That is insane," Webb said. "We are outnumbered 3-1. We were outnumbered at the saloon. We were outnumbered at the chapel." Sarah's voice rose with conviction. "Gentry thinks he has all the power. He thinks we are just rabbits waiting to be caught." Let us show him what happens when the rabbits bite back." Caleb looked at her, and a slow smile spread across his face. "You know something, Sarah Miller. You might just be the craziest woman I've ever met. Is that a yes?" He took her hand. "That is a hell yes." The plan was simple in its madness. While Webb and half the Rangers held the defensive position at Devil's Backbone, Caleb, Sarah, and a small strike force would use Hollis's information to infiltrate Gentry's camp from behind. Their goal was not to win the battle, but to capture Gentry himself. Without their leader, the hired guns would scatter. The Empire would fall. It was a desperate gamble, but desperate times called for desperate measures. They moved out at dusk, using the rough terrain to mask their approach. Hollis guided them through hidden trails and dry creek beds, paths that only someone intimate with Gentry's operation would know. Sarah rode beside Caleb, her rifle across her saddle horn. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it no longer controlled her. She had spent 3 years being afraid. She was done with fear. "Tell me about your mother," Caleb said quietly as they rode. "We have time." Sarah smiled, surprised by the question. She was beautiful, strong. She used to say that a Texas woman should be able to cook a meal, shoot a rifle, and quote scripture all before breakfast. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Sarah's voice softened with memory. "She used to sing to me at night. Old hymns, mostly. She said the songs would keep the darkness away. Did they? For a while. Then the real darkness came and no song could stop it." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "When this is over, I want you to teach me those songs." "Why?" "Because our children should know them." Sarah looked at him, her heart full to bursting. "Our children, if you will have me. If you will have a broken-down ranger with too many scars and not enough sense." She squeezed his hand. "I will have you, Caleb Sterling. Scars and all." They rode in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, full of promise and hope. They reached Gentry's camp as the moon rose over the hills. The enemy was spread out along the base of Devil's Backbone, campfires dotting the darkness like fallen stars. Gentry's tent was in the center, larger than the others, guarded by 2 men with rifles. "There," Hollis whispered, pointing. "That is where he sleeps. The prisoners are in the wagon near the horse corral." "How many guards?" 4 at the tent, 2 at the wagon, patrols every 15 minutes. Caleb turned to his small team, 5 Rangers who had volunteered for the mission. "Here is the plan. Martinez, you and Pike take out the guards at the wagon. Free the prisoners and get them to the horses. Thompson and Gray, you create a distraction on the north side. Fire and noise make them think we are attacking in force." "And us?" Sarah asked. "We go for Gentry." The Rangers moved out, melting into the shadows with the ease of men who had spent their lives hunting in the dark. Sarah followed Caleb toward the center of the camp, her heart pounding but her hands steady. They reached the edge of the firelight and waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, from the north, came the sound of gunfire and shouting. The distraction. The guards at Gentry's tent turned toward the commotion, their attention diverted. Caleb moved like a striking snake, crossing the distance in 3 long strides. His knife flashed and 1 guard fell. The second turned, raising his rifle, but Sarah was faster. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Inside, Caleb hissed. They burst into the tent to find Gentry already on his feet, a pistol in his hand. He was old, but his reflexes were sharp. He fired, the bullet singing past Caleb's ear. Caleb tackled him before he could fire again. They grappled on the floor, struggling for the gun. Gentry was stronger than he looked, fueled by desperation and rage. "You think you have won," Gentry snarled. "You think killing me will change anything? My empire will live on. There are others who will take my place. Then we will hunt them down too." Caleb wrenched the pistol away and pressed it against Gentry's temple. "It is over, Colonel. You are going to stand trial for your crimes. And then you are going to hang." Sarah stepped forward, the black book in her hands. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "Do you recognize my mother's handwriting?" Gentry's eyes went wide. "The Miller woman. You are her brat. Her name was Martha, and she kept records. Every bribe, every murder, Every woman you sold. It is all here. Your entire evil empire, written down for the world to see." Gentry's face twisted with rage. "You little witch. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I am dealing with." Sarah's voice was calm, cold. "I have been dealing with it for 3 years, but it ends tonight." Outside, the sounds of battle were fading. The distraction had become a rout as Gentry's men, leaderless and confused, began to scatter into the darkness. It was over. Almost over. Vane. Sarah turned at Caleb's warning shout. Silas Vane stood in the tent entrance, his face a mask of fury, a gun in each hand. "Let him go," Vane said. "Let him go, or I kill you both." Caleb did not move. "You are outnumbered, Vane. Your men are running. It is finished, not while I am still breathing." Vane's eyes were wild. "Gentry made me what I am. I owe him everything. Then you can join him in hell." Sarah did not hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired. The shot took Vane in the chest, staggering him backward. He looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt, then up at Sarah, his expression almost confused. "You," he whispered. "The deaf girl." "I was never deaf," Sarah said. "I heard everything. And now the whole world is going to hear it too." Vane fell, his guns clattering to the ground. He did not get up. Caleb bound Gentry's hands and hauled him to his feet. "Colonel Marcus Gentry," he said formally. "Under the authority of the state of Texas, you are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and trafficking in human beings. May God have mercy on your soul." "God has nothing to do with this," Gentry spat. "No," Sarah agreed. "He does not. This is justice, human justice. And it has been a long time coming." The trial of Colonel Marcus Gentry was the talk of Texas. They held it in Austin, in the largest courtroom in the territory, and still people lined up around the block hoping for a seat. Newspapers from as far away as New York sent reporters to cover the proceedings. Everyone wanted to witness the fall of the cattle baron who had ruled the border country like a feudal lord. Judge Harlan presided, his reputation for harsh sentences well earned. The hangman, they called him, and looking at his cold eyes, Sarah understood why. She testified on the 3rd day. She walked into that courtroom wearing a new dress, blue as the Texas sky, her hair pinned up properly for the first time in years. She was not the ragged girl from the saloon anymore. She was not the silent ghost who had hidden in the shadows. She was Sarah Miller, daughter of Martha Miller, and she had come to speak for the dead. The prosecutor led her through her story, the night her mother died, the 3 years of pretended deafness, the black book and the 47 names inside. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, and when she was done there was not a dry eye in the gallery. Then it was Gentry's turn. His lawyer tried to discredit her, called her a liar, a fraud, a woman with a grudge, said the book was a forgery, the testimony invented. Sarah did not flinch. "I have spent 3 years listening," she said, "listening to the secrets men tell when they think no one can hear. I know who is lying in this room, sir, and it is not me." The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. Judge Harlan pronounced the sentence with grim satisfaction. "Marcus Gentry, you have been found guilty of crimes against God and man, for the murder of Martha Miller, Mary Sterling, Samuel Sterling, Ethan Sterling, and others too numerous to name. You are sentenced to death by hanging. For the trafficking of 47 women into bondage, you are sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to give." They hanged him at dawn 2 weeks later. Sarah did not attend. She had seen enough death. Instead, she stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the sun rise over Austin. Caleb stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. "It is done," she said. "It is finally done." "No," Caleb replied. "It is just beginning." She looked at him, confused. "Gentry is dead, but his empire leaves a void. Someone needs to fill it with something better. The women who were sold need help rebuilding their lives. The ranches he stole need to be returned to their rightful owners. There is work to be done, and you want to do it. I want us to do it. Together. Sarah smiled, the first real smile she had felt in years. Together, she agreed, 1 year later. The ranch was called Second Chance, and it sprawled across 300 acres of Texas hill country. Caleb had bought the land with the reward money from bringing down gentry. He had built the house himself, board by board, nail by nail. It was not fancy. 4 rooms, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, a well that never ran dry. But it was home. Their home. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the distant hills. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, and the air smelled of sage and wildflowers. Behind her, she heard Caleb's footsteps, felt his arms wrap around her. "How is our little one this morning?" he asked, his hand resting on the curve of her belly. Restless, like his father, his or hers. Either way, a fighter. Caleb laughed, a sound that still surprised her with its warmth. He had laughed so rarely when they first met. Now he laughed every day. The last year had been full of healing, for both of them. Captain Webb had retired, passing the ranger badge to younger men. Rosa Delgado still ran her network, though now it operated in the open with the backing of the law. Reverend Elijah Cross had rebuilt Calvary Chapel, bigger and more beautiful than before, and the sign above the door read, "Where the silent found their voice." And Otis Miller, the drunk who had sold his daughter for $20, had died a hero at Devil's Backbone, giving his life to help them escape. His grave was on the hill behind the ranch, next to the graves of Mary and Samuel Sterling. Sarah visited those graves every Sunday, bringing flowers and prayers. Today was Sunday. She walked up the hill with Caleb, their hands intertwined, and knelt before her father's headstone. "You were weak, Daddy," she said softly. "For most of your life you were weak. But in the end, when it mattered most, you found your courage. I forgive you. And I hope, wherever you are, you have found peace." Caleb helped her to her feet and led her back toward the house, where smoke was rising from the chimney and breakfast was waiting. Sarah Miller had spent 3 years in silence. 3 years, hiding from a world that wanted to destroy her. But the silence was over now. She had found her voice, and it rang out clear and strong, a testament to survival, to justice, to love. Some folks called it a legend, the deaf girl who brought down an empire, the ranger who found redemption in the ashes of grief. But legends, friends, are just truths that refuse to die. And this truth lived on, in every woman who refused to be silent and every man who chose to listen. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.